It was the fourth year of World War II. At the Tehran Conference, the allies of the anti-Hitler coalition decided to open a second front in the west of Europe and to start Operation Overlord, or D-Day. The landing point was carefully selected, as previous experiences with attempts to capture European bridgeheads, including the Dieppe raid, had already led to defeats and numerous casualties. This time, Churchill and Roosevelt made a judicious choice of the location for the operation, in Normandy. It was difficult to choose a point. The sites were either too open and could have resulted in huge losses, or too obvious for the Third Reich, therefore were well guarded. Meanwhile, the Reich was actively preparing for the penetration of the enemies in Europe. The Western Front, led by the Commander-in-Chief Gerd von Rundstedt, was reinforced by new divisions. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel and other experienced German commanders turned the beaches into genuine, impregnable fortresses. Hundreds of thousands of Frenchmen were forced to work, building fortifications and long-term fire points, digging trenches, mining sea lanes and coasts, and mounting anti-tank peaks. Now, enemy tank formations, regardless of tides, had to fall into either one or the other trap. The so-called Atlantic Wall of Defense stretched from the borders of Spain to Denmark, but the Third Reich did not know where and when the attack would take place. Finally, British counterintelligence MI5 misled the Third Reich by creating dummy compounds of inflatable tanks and aircraft in Scotland and southern Britain. Thanks to counter-espionage tricks, the Germans were convinced that the main strike would be at Pas-de-Calais, the shortest sea route from Britain, and then along the entire front. Thus, they were forced to hold different positions and were unable to muster troops in one fist. British intelligence went even further. It forced Hitler to keep the main tank units in Paris to have the possibility to move them anywhere in France. Thus, the maritime borders were covered only by small tank formations. Moreover, English mathematicians were able to decipher the German data transmission machine, the Enigma. They could now read messages and play a sabotage radio game, providing the Reich with planned disinformation. Storming a port which was well protected by the Germans, having an experience of the Dieppe raid, would have been risky, so the Allies built artificial harbors. The top commanders of the tank troops developed and implemented projects of amphibious tanks, flamethrower tanks, anti-mine tanks, and other non-standard vehicles. The future President of the United States, General Dwight Eisenhower, was elected as Commander-in-Chief of all expeditionary forces. Operation Overlord was scheduled for May 1944, but due to storms and poor visibility, it was postponed to June. The anti-Hitler coalition had a plan provided for the Anglo-Canadian troops to intercept the main attack from the Third Reich's forces and reserves so that the American troops could safely advance. On the night of 5-6 June, the commander of the German troops received a telephone call informing him of the start of the Anglo-American landing operation. D-Day didn't go as planned. Some paratroopers broke their legs as a result of jumping from low altitudes. Some became targets in the air or fell into the hands of the Germans. Some were left without lighting equipment and could not send a signal. However, the German sentries in binoculars were already watching the approaching fleet, which was beginning to break through German defenses with the use of the ship's volleys. At the same time, an air attack on the fortification began. At dawn, on the beaches, began landings of Marine troops, including Canadians. On the beachheads, the soldiers encountered aggressive resistance. However, innovative equipment has done its job, and in the afternoon, the coalition troops have consolidated on 4 bridgeheads. Over 100,000 Allied soldiers were already in Normandy on the first day. In addition, the invasion of the anti-Hitler coalition unleashed the French people. Their urge to resist had been pushed by the German occupation. Tens of thousands began working for English intelligence and received coded messages on the radio. As a result, the French resorted to sabotage, cutting communications and power lines, and even blowing up railroads. It was true that the overall scope of the operation was almost unlimited. The exact number of soldiers, officers, and military personnel is still unknown and is estimated at between 2 and 3 million individuals. such a number of people live in modern Paris. The city of Caen was strategic for the coalition, which initially failed to be captured. The suburb area would have allowed the construction of landing strips. In addition, Montgomery planned to maneuver on the left flank, for which Caen was strategically important. This maneuver would have meant that the Reich's 7th Army would be forced to retreat, creating a gap in defenses between it and the 15th Army in the north, opening the way to Paris. The 7th British Armored Division was sent to the battle. However, the Battle of the German Tigers against the Sherman tanks ended with the defeat of the Allies, despite the actions of the aviation. The Allied forces' strategy worked, and American forces began moving towards another critical facility, the port of Cherbourg. At this time, storms destroyed the Allied artificial harbors, reinforcements were delayed, and Cherbourg acquired even greater importance. The 15th Army of the Reich was reinforced by troops and had 12 divisions, including 4 tanks. During this period, on the bridgehead in Normandy, German forces amounted to almost 900,000 soldiers and officers. They were faced by 13 American, 11 British, and 1 Canadian divisions. In total, about 1 million men. The railway link from Paris to the west and southwest was destroyed by Allied aircraft action and French partisans, making it difficult for the Germans to move reinforcements and ammunition. These actions led to long night marches. As a result, the Reich's troops were exhausted prior to the battle. Hitler subsequently held a meeting with Rommel and Rundstedt, who insisted on the withdrawal of the 7th Army and its unification with the 15th Army for defensive action. Nevertheless, they couldn't convince the Führer. Hitler's fanaticism influenced his rational thinking and led to an underestimation of the scale of the disaster. In the first week, the Allies landed more than 300,000 soldiers, more than 50,000 of various machines, and more than 100,000 tons of ammunition. In addition, despite losses and the worst storms in 40 years, the Allies quickly established the delivery of supplies, and from that moment, their troops had about 200 merchant ships arriving daily. 3 American divisions attacked the Cherbourg Peninsula on the 20th of June. Despite the success, the German forces managed to leave a ruin behind, so the port was unable to receive shipments until the end of the summer. The British, under Montgomery's leadership, established a southern bridgehead. Weather did not allow the Allies to use aviation, and the Reich troops threw into battle 2 tank divisions, including the 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich. The British were forced to retreat. However, as soon as the weather permitted, heavy bombers of the British Air Force cleared the way to Caen from the north and northwest. This successful tactic has become a standard. Because the defense failed and people panicked, Rundstedt was fired as the commander of the Western Front and replaced by Günther von Kluge. The city of Caen fell into the hands of the Allies prior to mid-July. The road to southern France was open. However, the losses were enormous. The Battle of Caen took about 50,000 soldiers from each side. Subsequently, fighter jets fired from low altitude on Rommel's service vehicle. The next day, the Montgomery offensive began. As many as 3 corps planned to expand the bridgehead. The operations of the British Air Force were even tougher than the day before. They completely brought out of action the Luftwaffe forces in the region. The abolished order to keep the 15th Army behind the Seine came too late. The Wehrmacht sent some fresh divisions to the 7th Army, but they arrived too late to level the front. During the same period, another assassination attempt was made on the life of A. Hitler. Colonel Count Klaus von Stauffenberg brought explosives to the meeting, but the oak table saved the Führer's life. The rebels announced Operation Valkyrie with an attempt to seize power in Berlin, but they were captured the same evening. The leaders were shot, and others were put on trial and hanged. Therefore, Hitler lost almost all shreds of credibility for his army and entourage. The overall strategy worked. The 7th American Corps launched Operation Cobra and attacked south of Saint-Lô. The success of the infantry was ensured by American aviation, after which tanks were thrown into the battle. German retreat routes were cut off, traffic jammed because of the retreating troops. the entire defense system became chaos. The Allied offensive continued, and the Air Force kept on attacking the enemy infantry. At last, the coalition occupied Avranches. The Canadians advanced from Caen along the Falaise Road. The Reich's 4 panzer divisions continued their aggressive resistance. Thus, they were able to stop the advance of the Canadian Corps and even throw it back for 3 kilometers. Commander Montgomery decided to move the main attack of the English troops to the south. He personally informed Prime Minister Churchill of the operation. Patton's Third Army entered the battle. 2 armored and 3 infantry divisions headed west. By the end of the first week of August, a garrison of 45,000 soldiers and the remnants of the 4 German divisions had been thrown back and cut off. While the battle was going on in the west, the second part of Patton's troops advanced eastward and occupied the city outside the city. At that time, however, communication problems appeared at the front. Supplies were coming from the coastal bases where the troops landed. This shortcoming was very dangerous, as Avranches could have been the site of a German strike. It was this idea that attracted Hitler, despite the fact that the top military leadership spoke out against and insisted on organizing a withdrawal to the Seine. The Führer insisted that the battle for Normandy was not lost and ordered to send fresh troops, 5 tank divisions and 2 infantry divisions. This attack fell on 1 American division, which received help from 3 more. 5 days of fierce fighting and mass bombardment led to the German retreat, as the Wehrmacht leadership presupposed, and the formation of a dispatch. The U.S. Third Army sent the Corps north. The location was reached in mid-August. The U.S. First Army and the British Second Army advanced south. The Canadian Army advanced in Falaise. As a result, in a few days, the so-called Falaise Pocket was formed, in which 8 German divisions were eliminated. More than 50,000 soldiers surrendered. Von Kluge reported to Hitler that human and material losses were colossal, and the morale of the troops was destroyed. After the defeat of the Reich in the south, the Allies moved northeast to join the British and advance on Rouen. Near Rouen, the Germans abandoned their numerous vehicles and began to flee by crossings, but could no longer resist on the opposite side. However, Eisenhower didn't rush to begin the battle for Paris. The previous experience of Stalingrad and Warsaw showed how terrible it can be to storm well-fortified cities. Nevertheless, the situation on the front developed successfully. Patton crossed the Seine and was aided by the French 2nd Armored Division, which landed at Normandy in early August. French partisans rebelled in Paris, and the local police began to strike. French troops insisted on being the first to enter Paris. After being informed of the street fighting, Eisenhower took action, and 3 days later ordered the capture of Paris. The next day, the first French troops approached Paris from the northeast. In the evening, tanks were standing on both sides of the Seine, ready to enter the capital the next morning. In the morning, the German army headquarters at the Le Maurice Hotel was cordoned off. The commander was taken to the police headquarters, and the garrison capitulated. Fighting spirit raged in Paris. Allied troops were met with applause. Charles de Gaulle placed his headquarters in the Ministry of War as the leader of the Free France. The success of the deal exceeded expectations. The German 7th Army effectively ceased to exist. Total enemy casualties were enormous: 400,000 soldiers and officers, 1,300 tanks, 20,000 trucks, and 1,500 units of artillery. The coalition suffered more than 200,000 casualties. General Eisenhower wrote in an official report that without the great sacrifices of the Anglo-Canadian troops, it would have been impossible to conduct successful military operations in the American regions. This was the beginning of the liberation of Europe, and the day of the landing is celebrated every year on June 6th.